mind and wait till we get to step number 3. I've got a surprise bombshell that's going to completely blow you away. And I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, the Fed buys corporate debt. To explain this further, let's go right to the Fed's website where they describe their programs, the PMCCF and the SMCCF. Establishment of 2 facilities to support credit to large employers. This is the primary market corporate credit facility for new bond and loan issuance and the secondary market corporate credit facility to provide liquidity for outstanding corporate bonds. So if you don't understand Fed speak, what they're doing is they're bailing out corporations and entities that own their debt. So the next question becomes, well, which corporations are these? Here are the top 15. We've got Toyota, Volkswagen, Daimler, AT&T, Apple, Verizon, GE, Ford, Comcast, BMW, Microsoft, a bevy, I'm not sure who that is, GM, CVS, and BP. A couple things I want to highlight that I'm sure you've already noticed is a lot of these corporations aren't even U.S. corporations. They're bailing out Toyota, Volkswagen, Daimler, and this is a real gem right here. Editor, let's go right to the article explaining Daimler and who their major shareholders actually are. The original Daimler-Benz was founded in Germany in 1926. Most of you know that it is a German corporation. But what you might not know, scrolling down a little further, is Daimler has several shareholders. Chinese investor and entrepreneur Li Shufu owns 10% of the group through an investment firm. Another Chinese company named Beijing Automotive Group, which is owned by the Beijing government, holds a 5% stake, and the Kuwait Sovereign Savings Fund has 6.8% of the group. What's fantastic is the Fed is not only bailing out a German corporation, but they're also bailing out their Chinese and Kuwaiti shareholders. But the madness gets a lot more extreme. They're also bailing out Apple. And I don't know if bailing out is the correct word, because right now on their balance sheet, Apple has over $50 billion in cash. In addition to that, they've got almost $50 billion in stock. So they've got $100 billion liquid right here. And the Fed is going in and buying their corporate bonds. One of the 2 main takeaways that we need to realize is the Fed is going further and further out the risk curve with their assets and what they're putting onto their balance sheet. Going further out the risk curve gives them higher yields on the assets they own. Before they were doing this with mortgage-backed securities, or sausages, as we like to call them, but they're getting a lot higher yield than they would otherwise be getting with treasuries alone. We're going to come back to this in step number 3. So make sure you make a mental note of that. But with these crazy programs, what the Fed is doing is they're creating a massive amount of moral hazard, malinvestment, and misallocation of resources. Editor, go ahead and throw up the chart of corporate debt going back to 2019 and the headline from CNBC. As we can see, in 2019, corporate debt issuance was almost $1.45 trillion. But moving on to this year, now that the market knows there's a Fed backstop in the corporate bond market, the debt issuance is almost twice as high. So let's think this through. Even if the Fed was justified by their rationale coming in and buying the debt of all these corporations, the only reason they're doing that is because the corporations themselves had too much debt relative to their income and cash on their balance sheet going into the cerveza sickness. So they're trying to solve a debt problem with more and more debt. This is just the unintended consequences that we always see with the Fed and the government. So if we were in a corporate debt bubble at 1.45 trillion in issuance, what are we going to be this year when the issuance goes up to 3 trillion or $4 trillion? And as insane as that sounds, just wait till we get to step number 2 and 3. And remember, the takeaway from step number 1 is the Fed is going further out the risk curve and they're getting a higher yield with the assets they're bringing onto their balance sheet. Step number 2, how the Fed goes bust or insolvent. Of course, it all starts with the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. So we've got a chart going back to 2008. On the left, we go from 1 trillion up to 4 trillion. Of course, this is an old chart because we know now the Fed's balance sheet has gone to infinity and beyond, over $7 trillion. But this serves the purpose well. Just for the example, we see that the bulk of the Fed's balance sheet is treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. Editor, go ahead and throw up the graph, and the viewers can see there's a lot that goes into their balance sheet, but 95% of it is mortgage-backed securities and treasuries. So we go to the Fed on the asset side, like we said, mortgage-backed securities, treasuries, liabilities, mostly bank reserves. These are reserves from the primary dealer banks and the banks under the Fed's umbrella. The Fed's balance sheet starts off okay, but what happens if the housing market collapses like it did in 2008, 2009, destroying the value of the mortgage-backed securities they have on their balance sheet, or if interest rates go up on the treasuries they have. So if the interest rates go up on those treasuries, the values will go down. So we could very easily see a situation where the assets really shrink, the value of the assets on the Fed's balance sheet, but the bank reserves are still the same. So in this situation, the Fed would be technically insolvent. Now, most people would say, okay, well, it's not a big deal, George, who cares? Because they can just print more bank reserves and it doesn't really affect the main purpose of the Fed, which really is mostly the liability side of their balance sheet. But what most people do, and the mistake I think they make, even the pros, is they focus on the Fed's balance sheet and they totally ignore the Fed's profit and loss. So let's think this through. The asset side of the Fed's balance sheet is producing income. The liability side, typically, it produces an expense. Why is that? Because of IOER, interest on excess reserves. Remember, back in 2008, the Fed changed the way they manipulated the Fed funds rate. Because they printed up so much funny money and bank reserves, they needed a way to get the rates above zero if need be. So they started paying the primary dealer banks and banks under the Fed's umbrella to hold their reserves at the Fed. So this is an expense. To give you a very simple example, let's walk through this. Let's say when the Fed's balance sheet is healthy, it's producing $200 on the asset side, and the liability side is producing $100 in expenses. But then we go through this potential situation where housing collapses, interest rates go up. Now, all of a sudden, the asset side may only be producing $50, but they still have $100 in expenses. Let's take it to an extreme and say that all the assets on the Fed's balance sheet went to zero. Of course, this can't happen because they do own gold. But just as a thought experiment, let's say it goes down to zero. So those of you who are really on the ball would say, George, it's not that big of a deal, again, because the Fed can go ahead and print up the bank reserves to pay IOER. Right, but they would be creating more bank reserves, which in and of themselves create more expense. So where does that end? You can see the liability of their balance sheet, including their expenses, would grow and grow and grow. What this really boils down to is who actually owns the Fed and what is the profit motive? To what degree is there a motivation to make profit? Let's think about this. If you owned the Fed, would you want your profit and loss to continue to get worse and worse and worse? Of course not. It's a rhetorical question. And if you did own the Fed and the profit went into your back pocket, wouldn't you find it convenient to use the cerveza sickness as an excuse to print up funny money out of nowhere at no expense to you whatsoever and go into the corporate bond market, buy corporate bonds because they have a higher yield? In other words, more profit. And to make things more interesting, they're going further and further out the risk curve, but the question becomes, do they absorb the losses or does the taxpayer? Step number 3, who gets the Fed's profit and what is their end game? This is where it's going to get really, really interesting. So in case you're wondering, it is officially stiff drink time. That is for sure. But to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, we've got to figure out who actually owns the Fed to understand what type of profit motive there may be. To do that, let's go right back to the internet.
So, who does own the Fed? Well, the stockholders do. The Federal Reserve pays dividends to its stockholders in the tune of a fixed 6% of claimed annual profits. Okay, so who are these shareholders? The Fed began with approximately 300 people or banks that became owners or stockholders purchasing stock at $100 per share in the Federal Reserve banking system. And it should be noted that none of these stocks were publicly traded. The Rothschilds and the Bank of England were instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve banking system in the U.S. They accomplished this through their control of stock holdings in major U.S. banks and having powerful subsidiary firms in New York. The two principal representatives in New York are J.P. Morgan Company and Kuhn, Loeb & Company, which were the firms that set up the Jekyll Island Conference where the Federal Reserve Act was drafted, and it was these firms that directed the successful campaigns to have the plan enacted into law by Congress in 1914. They were also sure to purchase the controlling amounts of stock in the Federal Reserve Bank in New York and had their principal officers appointed to the Federal Board of Governors and the Federal Advisory Council. They then continued to use their power and influence to purchase controlling shares in all the Federal Reserve regional banks as well. So there is a traceable linear connection between the Rothschilds, Bank of England, and the controlling shareholders for the entire U.S. Federal Reserve banking system today. Here is a list of the major families and firms who currently control the U.S. Federal Reserve.
So you can believe everything in that video or you can dismiss it. But the one thing we can say for sure is the Fed is owned by private entities or individuals. So the next question becomes, does the Fed give all of their profits to the Treasury? To answer that question, let's go right to a few articles on the internet that at the very least will surprise you and most likely will shock you. This is from the Brookings Institute. Contrary to most news coverage, the Federal Reserve Act does not require the Fed to remit profits to the Treasury. Congress imposed a franchise tax on the Fed in the original Federal Reserve Act of 1913, requiring the Fed to remit 100% of its earnings after paying expenses and dividends, lowering the tax in 1919 to 90%. But Congress stopped taxing the Fed in 1933, swapping the franchise tax for a one-time payment to help capitalize the newly created FDIC. Today, an internal Fed policy still guides remittances, absent a statutory mandate. Now, I want to point out in 1947, after World War II, the Fed did go back to the Treasury and say they'd give them a percentage of their profits. But the Fed proactively did this. And according to the Brookings Institute, the Fed seemed to have several motivations for moving independently of Congress in 1947 to formalize a policy. First, the Fed sought to preempt congressional critics angling to reinstate the franchise tax. Moving first allowed the Fed to protect its independence and flexibility over the level of profits returned to the Treasury. So the main takeaway from this article is the Fed still retains control over how much profit they give to the Treasury. To further support the Brookings Institute article, I found a post from the Fed's website going all the way back to 1947, which backs up every single thing they say. And more recently, on the Atlanta Fed website, they talk about the surplus account. The Federal Reserve surplus account is similar to what most corporations call retained earnings. That is, it is the accumulation of comprehensive net income after remittances to the Treasury. I want to emphasize, after remittances to the Treasury. That has not been paid out as dividends. So this is after expenses, after dividends, after whatever profit they agree to give the Treasury has gone to them. So they are definitely retaining some of the profit. The question becomes, how much profit are they actually keeping? And let's remember, we can't audit the Fed. We have to take their word on everything. The post goes on and gets extremely bizarre, where they start talking about the Federal Reserve not paying the Treasury, and somehow this wouldn't have any effect whatsoever on the taxpayer. I mean, think of the mental gymnastics that are required to connect those dots. But let me read it and you can hear it for yourself. First, suppose the Federal Reserve had remitted all of the earnings to the Treasury. In this case, the Treasury would be able to issue less debt, reducing the Treasury's interest expense. Okay, that makes sense. Suppose, however, the Fed retains the earnings in its surplus account and uses the extra funds to expand the Federal Reserve's Treasury portfolio by an equal amount. Okay. The Federal Reserve would then have higher earnings in the next period, which it would then remit to the Treasury. These two alternatives would have essentially, notice they throw the word essentially, the same implications for the Treasury interest payments net of Federal Reserve remittances. What I want to highlight here is they're saying it wouldn't have any implications for the interest payments. They didn't say anything about the principal. Then they've got the huevos to add to that. In other words, the Fed's holding of a surplus account does not increase the burden of interest payments on the U.S. taxpayer. Yeah, it doesn't increase the interest payments, but it massively increases the amount of principal that the U.S. taxpayer is on the hook for. Let me explain this a little further to make sure everyone's on the same page. I don't want to get too sidetracked with this, but I think it's crucial that all of you watching this video understand how willing the Fed is to pull the wool over your eyes. We start this example by assuming the Treasury has $100 in debt. The Fed had $100 in profit that year. Well, if the Fed gives the $100 to the Treasury, we'll call this option A, then the Treasury the next year could spend the profit they received from the Fed. If the Fed doesn't give them the $100, then they need to borrow an additional $100, so then the national debt would equal $200. But what this crazy person is talking about with the Fed, using their pretzel logic, is the Fed could just take the $100 and instead of giving it to the Treasury, well, when the Treasury issues the new $100 worth of debt, the Fed can take the $100, buy this debt, so that $100 goes into the market, this $100 of debt goes onto the Fed's balance sheet, and when they make a profit from this $100, well, that goes right back to the Treasury. So if we think this through, the Treasury in example A would have $100 of debt, and let's say they're paying $5 of interest on that. Example B, they'd have $200 in debt, but because the Fed owns the additional $100, their interest payments would still be $5. So that's why this moron on the Fed's website used his words very, very carefully. He never said that there wouldn't be an increase in principal to the taxpayer. He only said that the interest payments wouldn't go up at all. Basically what he's saying is regardless of whether the government had $1 trillion in debt or $100 trillion in debt, it wouldn't matter to the taxpayer at all as long as the Fed owned $99 trillion out of the $100, because the interest payments on the $99 would go right back to the Treasury. So on net balance, the taxpayer would still only be liable for interest payments on the $1 trillion. But I'd like to ask you as a taxpayer, would you rather be on the hook for $1 trillion or $100 trillion? I think that's pretty much a no-brainer. So we've looked at the profit side of the equation, and even if you're a die-hard Fed supporter like your friend and family member Fred, you've got to admit the waters are incredibly murky when you start peeling back the layers of the onion to try to determine how much of a profit motive there is for the individual entities and people who own the Federal Reserve. But let's move on and start talking about the risk side of the equation. And to do this, let's go right back to the internet and Yale University's website. I think the title of this article says it all. Mnuchin clarifies the Treasury is prepared to lose money on Fed programs. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin clarified Tuesday that the Treasury is prepared to take losses as it provides unprecedented credit support to the Federal Reserve's lending programs. The answer is absolutely yes, Mnuchin said in his response to questions from legislators in a virtual hearing of the Senate Banking Committee. By definition, that capital is at risk, and we are fully prepared to take losses in certain scenarios on that capital. I like how he says we are fully prepared, meaning the taxpayer. I'm not fully prepared. I don't know about you. In March, Congress made a $500 billion funding pool available to the Treasury Department, part of the $2 trillion CARES Act. During the same interview, Fed Chair Powell said, "We do these programs with the consent of the Treasury Secretary and with fiscal backing from Congress through the Treasury." He also said, "We are using that fiscal backstop to absorb any losses that we have." And just to make sure everyone is on the same page, what he's saying is he's using taxpayer dollars to absorb any losses the Federal Reserve has. So what they're doing is they're privatizing the profits, but they're socializing the losses. And ask yourself this question right now. If you owned the Federal Reserve, assuming you had no moral compass and basically the ethics of Satan, isn't that what you would want? Wouldn't you want your business to have private profits and socialized losses by the taxpayer? It makes you think, to say the least. Oh, but wait, there is more. In fact, there's a lot more, unfortunately. Let's check out a chart of the excess reserves. So these are the bank reserves held at the Fed. And of course, now there is no reserve requirement whatsoever. So any reserves held at the Fed are excess reserves. These make up the majority of the liabilities on the Fed's balance sheet, which remember is the expense side of the equation. This chart goes back to 2000 all the way to 2020. On the left, we go from 0 up to 400 billion, really where it starts, goes all the way up to 3.6 trillion. You see it really flatlined prior to the GFC. There were really very few bank reserves in the system. But of course, we have quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, Operation Twist, you name it. So the bank reserves go parabolic from almost 0 all the way up to call it 3.2 trillion in 2015. Then they do quantitative tightening. They have to put on the brakes because of the spike in the repo market where interest rates went through the roof. The whole system almost came crashing in on itself. And we have the cerveza sickness. So the Fed takes their balance sheet from under 4 trillion all the way up to 7 trillion, which has taken the excess bank reserves in the system up to 3.6 trillion. And I'm sure that is also going to infinity and beyond. But why this is a big deal is because of NIRP. Let's not forget about negative interest rate policy. If the Fed is set up to pay the banks interest through IOER on their bank reserves when the interest rate is positive, if the interest rate is negative, the banks would have to pay the Fed on their bank reserves. So think about this. If interest rates go negative on Fed funds, that means the liability side of their balance sheet turns into a revenue stream. That would be profit for the Fed. Now I want you to put your Fed owner hat right back on, or devil horns, whichever you prefer. Latter's probably most appropriate. And let's take it to the next step. So if we can assume the higher the bank reserves are, the more money that's coming into your back pocket, you would want the bank reserves as high as possible. Well, how do you do that? Well, let's just assume we have a pandemic around the world and we have this cerveza sickness in the United States. You would come flying into the rescue, printing up more bank reserves to go into the asset markets, like the corporate bond market, and buy bonds. Because the only way that you can get money to buy the bonds is if you print more and more bank reserves. And of course, if you were the owner of the Fed, you'd try to limit your downside as much as possible buying the debt of individual corporations that had a fortress type of balance sheet, such as Apple and Microsoft. You see how this comes full circle, and you just cannot make this stuff up. You've got to dive in and do the due diligence and the research. But let's continue to go down the rabbit hole a little bit further, and this is really going to blow your mind. So we've got a pie chart of the Fed's assets, or some of them: fixed income, gold, potentially bank reserves if interest rates go negative. But what would have to happen for them to take rates negative, the Fed funds? Well, we'd have to have a stock market crash. Something bad would really have to happen. In other words, there would have to be a lot of volatility. So you could say that having these bank reserves as an asset would be a way for the Fed to go long volatility. And in the future, they'll most likely buy equities. And editor, go ahead and throw up the list that we used in step number 1. We see at the bottom of the list, the Fed is already buying debt of BP, British Petroleum. In other words, energy. So the Fed has fixed income, gold, energy, they're long volatility, and in the future, they'll most likely have equities. I wonder what that portfolio looks like. That's right, it looks exactly like Chris Cole's Dragon portfolio. And I'm not here to imply or to say that the Fed is intentionally setting up a Dragon portfolio. I think that's beyond their level of intelligence. They probably are just doing it inadvertently. But it is interesting to think about. If you were in charge of the Fed, the largest hedge fund in the world that could print its own money, you're never ever audited, and you have no moral compass whatsoever. You have the ethics of Satan. Wouldn't you do the exact same thing? Let me know what you think in the comments below. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.